Hi, everyone. Can you hear me with this? Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm Raz Siegel from the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, and it's a special honor, privilege, and pleasure, Professor Dwork, to welcome you to Stockton University today. Deborah Dwork is the Rose Professor of Holocaust History and the founding director of the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Professor Dwork is truly a model scholar. She has written path-breaking books, 8 altogether, with a new one titled Saints and Liars, now in the making, about which we will hear today. She has taught countless undergraduate students and nearly all her doctoral students. 24 former and current doctoral students altogether are working full-time in academia, museums, and organizations that deal with the Holocaust and genocide. And she has been and is engaged in various ways in public education, in bridging between the academic world and the many national and international discussions about the Holocaust and genocide. This record in itself is incredibly impressive, but there is more. As Professor Dwork envisioned, founded, and grew the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University into the preeminent institution for doctoral training in Holocaust history and genocide studies. In other words, she has created and led for 20 years a central institute that has shaped and is shaping Holocaust and genocide scholarship and education. Professor Dwork's central position in the field is widely recognized, and she has received numerous awards for her work. Professor Dwork has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, among many others. Professor Dwork is a member of the U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and she serves on many advisory boards and works with nonprofit organizations and foundations concerned with Holocaust education. Professor Dwork serves this year as the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. Professor Dwork was one of the first historians to record Holocaust survivors' oral histories and to use their narratives as a scholarly source in her work on the social and cultural history of the Holocaust. Her books, really truly path-breaking works, and my students and others maybe are using her books as central texts in my course. Her books include the now classic Children of the Star, translated into many languages and the subject of a CBC documentary. Recognizing that history focused almost only on the adult world, Professor Dwork imagined a new child-centered approach, a wholly original theoretical development that raised new questions and pointed to new analytical horizons. Auschwitz, co-authored with Robert Jan van Pild, received the National Jewish Book Award and the Shapiro-Kostoff Award. This book prompted the Emmy-nominated BBC documentary Auschwitz, The Blueprint of Genocide. Holocaust, the History, the book that I use in many of my courses, and this course where students of mine are here today, Holocaust History, and again in collaboration with Van Pilt, and also translated into a number of languages, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. This book was the first work to place the Holocaust firmly within the context of World War II, the first to discuss in depth the Holocaust in the midst of the experiences of non-Jews under German occupation, and the first to negotiate the chasm between histories of the perpetrators and that of the victims, between the Nazis' push towards a final solution and the Jews' reactions and responses. The first to do all these things, really, really trailblazing in the field. Dwork's co-authored Flight from the Reich, Jewish Refugees, 1933 to 1946, integrated the refugee experiences now into the history of the Holocaust, and because Jews fled wherever they could, from Argentina to Shanghai, the book presents and discusses a truly global history with insights that are unfortunately very relevant today in our world of genocidal violence and more than 65 million refugees. Above all, Professor Dwork is a teacher and mentor to undergraduate and doctoral students, committed to training the next generation of Holocaust and genocide scholars and educators. And her students value her commitment greatly. I know this because I am your student, Deborah, and I've learned and continue to learn from you greatly how to think, how to ask questions, how to write, how to teach, how to build collaborations in the field, how to envision the future of the field, and much, much more. You are, as I said at the beginning of this introduction, a truly model scholar for me and many others. And so it is truly an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to host you at Stockton today. And I am excited, as my students are, to learn about your current research project. So please join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Dwork.
You better believe I'm getting a copy of that for my mother. Thank you, Raz. Thank you very much for that lovely, lovely introduction. And is the mic working? Great. And thank you, each and every one of you, for braving the snow and for foregoing the sunshine. You know, it's beautiful sunshine out there, but you'll find that out later, not now. So thank you very much for coming. Having said all of that, each of you has a handout. Does anybody need a handout? You need one? Couple? Here they come. I will wait until they're there. There's some people over on that side. Oh, wait, here's one. Okay. Does everyone have one, or can you share? Yes? Hello? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, what is the point of these handouts? If you are like I am, then often I'm listening to something on the news, and after I've heard it, I say, what'd he say? So the point of this handout is to tell you what I said, so that you don't get lost, so that you can follow along and you see where we're going. The other point of this handout is that just when you are thinking, when will this woman ever stop talking, take a look at the handout, see where we are, and pace yourselves to the end, okay? The last thing to tell you is that I will speak for 42 minutes as per instructed by Raz, plus minus 10%, depending upon how often I breathe and also how often I interrupt myself to tell you something else that you just need to know. So let's start with the purpose of this. I have 3 aims with my present project, Flight from the Reich. The first is, who were these Americans who hurtled into action to help endangered people in Europe? Europeans were trying to come the other way. They were going from Europe west. These Americans went from the west to the east, right? They went in the opposite direction. Who were they? What animated them? So that's the first. The second is that gender looms large in this story. Social work was long considered women's domain, but this social work offered women the opportunity to do things that they never would have had the opportunity to do if they had stayed at home in America. So they were free, they were empowered, and they were free to challenge social norms. The work proved transformative. In fact, regardless of gender, whether male or female, the work proved transformative. Transformative for the people they helped, and transformative for them too as individuals. And finally, and what's most interesting for me, I must say, is that I explore the messy factors in history. So in an earlier book, I began to think about messy factors like luck, timing, fortuitous circumstance. And let me give you an example. So now I'm coming back. Goodbye. It was in my face. Yeah. Let me give you an example of how, let me just give you an example to illustrate this particular point. Hannah Starkman, she's on your list. Check, make sure. Yes, hello? Good, very good. She was then aged 12. She was with her mother and her brother Henyak in the German-imposed ghetto for Jews in the Polish city of Radom. And this is now from her oral history. One night, we heard shooting. We went to the window, and we saw people running and German soldiers shooting. We got dressed, and then a couple of minutes later, we heard German soldiers in the building yelling, "Raus, raus, raus." So we all went out, and there were masses of people in the street. You could go either right or left when you got into the street. We stood there, my mother and I, for, I don't know, maybe about half an hour. And then they told us to go back into the apartment house. We didn't know what happened. We found out later. Radom had two ghettos, a small ghetto on one side of town and the bigger ghetto where we were in another part of town. They sent everybody out from the small ghetto to the Treblinka annihilation camp. But the Germans had a few cars, those cattle cars, train cars, left over. So they needed more people to fill them. So they got all the people out from the big ghetto on the street, and they counted how many people they needed. So some of our neighbors who, when they left the apartment, went to the right, they were sent to Treblinka that night. And we, because we turned left, we were not sent out. The luck of the draw. So later on, when my brother came home from work and my neighbor's son came home, he didn't find his mother and sister. My brother found us. It was just one of those things. I'm not minimizing the importance of ideology, of policy, of practice. If it weren't for ideology and policy and practice, none of those Jews would have been in that situation at that time at all. But luck was with them that particular night. Luck, fortuitous circumstance, the fact that they just happened to go one way, that saved them on that particular occasion. So historians, let me start somewhere else. I am a social historian. Social historians typically look at class, race, occupation. They look at these factors. They don't look at these more slippery factors, luck, fortuitous circumstance, timing. We know that those were important. We don't know how to analyze them, so we just ignore them. You're with me? Thank you. In this book, I want to move from those slippery, less concrete factors to the really messy. And the really messy is the irrational. Human relations, emotions. Our Americans, these Americans who hurtled into action, they were operatives of improbable courage, resourcefulness, resilience. They were fueled by principles, to be sure, but they were fueled too by personal and professional ambition, by eagerness to actualize their potential. They were fueled by a taste for adventure. They were fueled by frustration with limitations. Social ties counted for a lot with them, and emotions played no small role, as did irrational responses. So, aim number 3, in short, is to take very seriously the ways in which the irrational shaped the past. When you get up in the morning and you turn on the news, you hear the irrational, right? And you understand how the irrational governs our lives. And yet when we think about the past, we impose a structure of rationality. We somehow assume, without challenging that assumption, that the people in the past behaved rationally. They didn't. And so what I would like you to do is to think anew about history. So my goal today is not to have you learn any particular chapter of history. My goal today is to encourage you to think about the past differently, to think about people in the past having lives as rich and as complicated and as full of passion as your own lives are today. Okay? So now let me go to some examples. Let me go to some snapshots. Prague, 1939. You're with me on the handout? Okay. The Munich Pact of September 30th, 1938. The Munich Pact gave Sudetenland to Germany without a shot fired. Still, this assault claimed the attention of the American Unitarian Association, the AUA, which had its headquarters in Boston at that time. And that is how the Unitarians begin the origin story of their Unitarian Service Committee, the USC. That's how they tell the story. Now let's shift the frame. The Germans had marched into Austria half a year earlier. The AUA could have been concerned, but no one sprang into action. So, what's up with Czechoslovakia? Why now? Why then? Clearly, Czechoslovakia held a different place in the Unitarian leadership's political imagination and emotional heart than did Austria. In 1938, Czechoslovakia was home to a 3,500 person Unitarian community. It was founded by Norbert Kopek. You'll see his name on the list. With the main church, wait for the name, everybody. Wait for the name, Unitaria in Prague. Kopek's daughter, Bodana, and her husband, Karl Haspel, had graduated from the Pacific Unitarian School of Religion in Berkeley, California. Charlotte Masaryk, the deceased wife of Thomas Masaryk, the president of Czechoslovakia from 1918 to 1935. Charlotte Masaryk was an American Unitarian. So where am I going with this? Ties of kinship, ties of friendship abounded between the Unitarians in the United States and Czechoslovakia. And these added weight and gravity to the AUA assessment of the situation after Sudetenland. I have just listened to the news broadcast from Prague in regard to the Czech crisis. One Howard Matson wrote to AUA President Frederick Elliott. We Unitarians have so many connections with our fellows in Czechoslovakia that we have a special obligation for action. The board agreed, and they promptly dispatched Robert Dexter, director of the AUA Department of Social Relations, to Europe. Some 200,000 refugees crowded into Prague at that time, and at least 25,000 needed to emigrate urgently. This Dexter wrote back to headquarters in Boston. The Unitarian leadership did not dither. They looked for a minister and his wife to bring witness, as they called it, to Prague. According to Waitstill Sharp, and if you look on your list, he's one of our Americans. According to Waitstill, 17 ministers and their wives, because at that time Unitarian ministers all were male, not yet women, admitted to the clergy. Anyway, according to Waitstill, 17 men and their wives had been approached. All declined. He was the 18th asked, and he and his wife Martha accepted. They sailed for Europe in February 1939. She was 33, he was 37, and they left their 2-year-old daughter, Martha, content, and their 7-year-old son, Hastings, with their friends. So ask yourselves, what prompted them to agree? Why did they agree when everybody else had said no? Most particularly, what prompted Martha to defy gender role expectations, leaving her children at home while she sailed off? What did she imagine she would achieve? And what did she, in fact, accomplish on the ground? Ha! I asked you the questions, but you have to wait for the book for the answer. Where I'm going to go now is to the transformative nature of the work on them. Martha's tenure in Prague was but the beginning of a previously unimagined professional trajectory. She was utterly committed to her work. As Waitstill, who hoped that she would join him for a really 2-day vacation in Switzerland, observed, there's no use making a reservation for us here if you are intending to stay with your beloved refugees in Prague. She didn't go to Switzerland. She stayed with her refugees in Prague. My darling Waitstill, she replied, I am terribly lonely without you. I think that the experience here has made me realize how much I love you. We need more quiet times together when we aren't really rushed to death by the clock. Somehow, we have to begin to tell the world where it gets off. She didn't, nor did he. August 10, 1940. We have never separated so completely since we were married, Waitstill lamented. So I fast forward through their work in France and Portugal, their individual decisions to leave the Unitarian Service Committee for other relief and rescue operations. I fast forward all of this to the Democratic Party's invitation to Martha to run for the House of Representatives seat, a House of Representatives seat just outside of Boston in 1946. At that point, Martha was in Massachusetts with the children, but often on the road as a key fundraising speaker for Hadassah. Waite still had returned to Prague, and he was commenting to her, writing to her by letter about her decision to run for office. I don't see much prospect of rootage with the family in the mad glare and dash of public life. Perhaps none of the rest of you three, meaning Martha, Hastings, and Martha Content, wife and the two children, perhaps none of the rest of you three want any rootage, but I suspect that two of you do. 2 out of the 3 of you do, and want it with thoughts too deep for tears. 7 years ago, at this hour, you and I were getting off the train here in Wilson Station in Prague, and all our world has been different ever since. I don't believe that you have ever taken in the continuous sinking feeling that beset the parsonage when you headed outward. It was so real you could have weighed it. We finally could not count on any time that you wouldn't be off to a talk or a tea or a committee meeting or across the continent. There have been times out here when I have been almost desperate between the amount of work to do and loneliness. I can't touch a woman. I see nothing but men's things in my wardrobe. I smell no perfume. I see in my mind's eye the hotel room in Lisbon and all your beauty junk on the shelf. It was in the way then, but I wish it were in the way now. 7 years ago tonight, we stepped off the train into Wilson Station and into a new world. Their marriage limped on for another 8 years. Martha and Waite still divorced in 1954. Many husbands and wives divorce. Even in 1954, husbands and wives divorced. My point is that this particular couple divorced because of the ways in which Martha had been changed by the work she did. Her experiences had changed her. She was no longer the minister's wife. Okay, we're on to snapshot number 2, Vilna, 1940. You with me? Thank you. In September 1939, it was clear that Lithuania might become a neutral island in the midst of a spreading sea of war. You can all look it up on a map later. Just trust me for that. The JDC, that's the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, on your list. The JDC had a long record of aid to Lithuanian Jews and to Jews in Vilna and its environs. They saw a spot of looming need and an opportunity for constructive action. European Director of Operations, JDC Operations, Morris Troper, detailed the recently hired Moses Beckelman to Kaunas. He arrived in October 1939. Isaac Gitterman, also on your list, right? Take a look. Thank you. Isaac Gitterman was director of JDC operations in Poland, and he fled from Warsaw and joined Beckelman soon thereafter. Thousands of Polish Jews were, like Gitterman, eager to reach Lithuania. Seeking to escape the German advance, they fled into the Suwałki district, that's also on your list, in the hope of slipping across the border from Poland into Lithuania. According to a report by Beckelman, there were 15,000 Jews in the district when the Germans annexed it to the Reich, and the Germans unrolled a new expulsion order in October 1939. They announced that Jews in the Suwałki were to go to Lithuania, and Germans in Lithuania were to come to Suwałki. Nazi authorities, and now I'm quoting Beckelman's report, escorted Jews to the frontier. And when the Lit guards refused to admit them into Lithuania, they were told by the Germans to make their own way over the frontier as best they could, but not to return to German Poland under penalty of death. All papers, passports, etc., were taken from them and destroyed. Lithuania was in a bind. Beckelman quoted the vice premier's observation that while Lithuania could perfectly well admit 500 or even 1,000 such refugees, this would simply constitute an invitation to the Germans to send masses over the border. Does this sound familiar to you? Just by the way. These thousands, says the vice premier, would swamp the country. Still, several hundred made their way into the country. And, again from Beckelman, about 1,000 were scattered at various points along the frontier in a no man's land at the beginning of November. Asked to send aid, the Lithuanian Red Cross declined on the grounds that those Jews were not Lithuanian citizens. They were Polish citizens. At the same time, the Lithuanian frontier guards refused to allow Jews in the district to bring the people in no man's land food and clothing. So the refugees were left in the open field without shelter, without heating, it's November, without food, without medical care. It is impossible to overemphasize the devotion and sacrifice of these small Jewish communities, Beckelman wrote. Comparing their activities to the Underground Railway of the Civil War era, Beckelman explained that the actual work of smuggling the Jews in no man's land over the border into Lithuania was carried out by Jewish young people, young men, young women of university age, your age, in fact. He admired, Beckelman did, he admired their dedication. What about his own role? By a miracle, I happen to have found several months of his diary, October 1st through December of that year, just completely by accident, totally by accident. Trust me, it was really by accident. I would love to say I was so smart, but no. So I found this diary. So what now comes is from his diary. What came before were the reports that he was sending back to headquarters. So what about his own role? His diary entry, just from that time, says, Troper, remember Troper? The guy who's the head of the European director? Yes? Hello? Okay. Troper called from Geneva. He may come to count us at the end of the week, and I have a notion that I'm going to be pulled out of here. I keep my fingers crossed, hoping. And November 8, Katz was a colleague in Lithuania. Katz and I had supper together, and Katz pumped me for all he was worth on my relations with Gitterman. Katz's brother-in-law has apparently buzzed him on the story that Gitterman has been trying to line up Jewish political party support for his proposal to serve as JDC representative for Eastern Europe. Katz thinks Gitterman's doing me dirt, but I'm not sure. I'd be just as well satisfied to be shifted elsewhere. I've about had my belly full of this part of the world, except that I would like to see Moscow before I pull out. And I'm beginning to feel more and more that this will have turned out to be the junior prom for which I was waiting, and that when I get back to the States, I'll be ready for a cushy administrative berth, a house in the country, and a wife. Kids, I'm still not sure about. And here comes the role of contingency. The big news, he wrote the next day, is that Troper can't come to Kaunas. New York won't let him. So Gitterman and I will either meet him in Stockholm or go to Amsterdam. I'll make book that Gitterman will pretend to be sorry, but actually he'll be pleased. Gitterman and Beckelman traveled to the Latvian port of Liepāja, where they boarded an Estonian ship to get to Sweden, to get to Amsterdam. The Germans seized the vessel en route. Beckelman, with his U.S. passport, was eventually released. Gitterman, with his Polish passport, was imprisoned in Germany until March 1940, and then returned to Warsaw, where he resumed his role of attending to the needs of the Jewish population. Gitterman was killed by bullet during the first phase of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in January 1943. Moses Beckelman returned to Vilna, where he remained until February 1941, a lone American in a weak neutral state that was overrun by the Soviets halfway through 1940. Both men served the needs of the Jewish community to the very best of their abilities, and honorably, wholeheartedly, and totally committedly. Shanghai, 1941. Next. Ready? If I'd been a man, I would have joined the Navy and seen the world. But since I am a woman, I joined the JDC. Social worker Laura Margolis, part of an oral history that she recorded. Margolis's wartime trajectory was marked repeatedly by chance and fortuitous timing. She was the first woman JDC field agent. She was detailed to Cuba in January 1939 to aid the 5,000 European Jewish refugees who had fled to that island of Cuba, fled Hitler's Germany to that island. Less than half a year later, she became a key participant in unsuccessful negotiations when the SS St. Louis, that now famous ship, neared Havana Harbor. That was May 1939. Seasoned by her Cuba experience, she accepted an assignment in Shanghai, where now May 1941. This assignment was to help the 20,000 European Jews who had fled Nazi Europe to go to this unique city in China that did not require an entry visa. So 20,000 European Jews. She went there to help them re-immigrate, move on. But, so unlike other operatives who started out doing relief work, and then situation got worse and worse. They went on to rescue activities. For Laura Margolis, the trajectory arced the other way. She went to help with re-immigration, but there she was when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and half the world away occupied the whole of the city of Shanghai. So at that point, there was no possibility of re-immigration. At that point, Shanghai was cut off from further movement, and it became her job to keep this community of 20,000 people alive through the war. How was she to meet these basic requirements? Again, for the daily grind, wait for the book. What I want to do is to introduce you to what she was facing on the ground. How did she manage to keep 20,000 people alive in Shanghai throughout the war? Our main problem, she declared in a confidential report to the JDC leadership, was not the Japanese or their occupation of Shanghai. While the handicaps were numerous, least of all the handicaps were the Japanese. Rather, she said, the problem rested with the Jews, especially the pre-Nazi era residents. At no time did we have a real choice when it became necessary to appoint leaders and committees. We had to accept the best Shanghai had to offer. And the best were either men who accepted the responsibility because they were forced to do so by the Japanese, or men with strong power drives. Margolis despised these men, and you can believe they despised her. Her reports to the JDC detail her frustration with, as she wrote, the complete apathy of all local Jewry to the refugee problem. She had a strong sense of communal responsibility. Shanghai, she observed, was marked by the absence of a real community. She was a determined single woman endowed with power as a JDC representative. They were men with traditional ideas of women's roles and traditional ideas of their own importance. She was a social work professional. In her view, these guys didn't even qualify as amateurs. These personal interactions and emotions hindered the development of relief operations. Yet, Margolis persevered. She negotiated this complex reality, and she kept that refugee community alive. Okay, I'm in my last case, Marseille, in the spring of 1942. Do you want to take a breath? You ready? Okay. So we're in Marseille in the spring of 1942. The American Friends Service Committee, that's the AFSC or the Quakers, set up headquarters in Marseille, where they were well situated to support local branches serving transit camps in the south of France. The Quakers, you need a little bit of background before we can get to the point. The Quakers teamed, I think it's on your list, the Quakers teamed up with OSCOM, the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, yes? Okay, so they teamed up with OSCOM to sponsor a group of 100 children to immigrate to the United States. In the meantime, the French Jewish philanthropic organization OSE managed to obtain the release of a number of youngsters from the transit camps in which the Germans had incarcerated Jews. So this philanthropic organization got children, Jewish children, out and put them into orphanages, into different children's homes, and what they were also called children's colonies, meaning like a vacation spots. Okay. The Jose officials worried most about the oldest of those children because the adolescents, this is now the Jose workers, were writing to the Quakers, take the oldest kids because they really deserve special consideration. And they wrote, I quote, according to regulations in respect to alien subjects living in France, the child is considered an adult when he or she reaches age 15. And worse, this situation becomes more and more tragic when the child draws near the fatal age of 17, when he will be re-interned in a transit camp. So whom to help? Who should, of all the children, who were they going to choose to make up the 100? Preparing for the fourth transport, Marjorie McClelland of the Marseille office. And I love Marjorie McClelland. Marjorie McClelland is my friend over that 70-year gap between now and when she was operating. Still, I look at her record critically. So preparing this fourth transport, she reflected upon her calculus of decision-making. It has all to be done in a terrific rush, she wrote to Margaret Frawley in the Home Office in Philadelphia. When your cable came announcing another convoy of 50 children and suggesting that I be given responsibility for selecting the children, it called for some deliberation. I had hoped originally to spend several days in each children's colony, observing the children at work and play and talking to their teachers. In that way, I had hoped to make some sort of sound evaluation of the children, even though I was not able to give them intelligence tests or make selections on what could really be considered a sound psychological basis. To her regret, she didn't have time for any of that. The realities of my procedure were far different from my plans because with the necessity for speed, it was necessary for me to make a lightning tour of the colonies, choosing the children after only the most superficial consideration. I had in mind two basic considerations: the necessity for emigration and the desirability of immigration for each child. I wished to satisfy myself, insofar it was possible under those circumstances, of the child's desirability as an immigrant to America, that he was normal, at least averagely intelligent, an adaptable child who would be able to fit into the American family without too much difficulty. But life on the ground in Europe carried weight for Marjorie McClelland, too. I also took into consideration the situation of the child here in Europe, for obviously not all cases were similar. I considered the children who had lost one or both parents, children whose parents had remained in Germany or had been deported to Poland, children who were all alone, without any family. They have less future here and therefore greater need for emigration. Thoughtful and rational as those considerations were, the essentially emotional nature of these decisions how she selected the children emerges in the short biographies that she wrote of all of those 50 children whom she selected. Henri and Miriam Mas, aged 6 and 8 respectively, serve as an example. Polish by nationality, they were born in Antwerp, where their parents owned a small restaurant. The family had fled to the south of France after the Germans had occupied the Low Countries in May 1940. The father, Samuel, was put to forced labor in January 1941, and the mother, Regina, and children were interned in the transit camp of Rivesaltes, which is where Marjorie McClelland met them. Regina Mas, and now I quote from Marjorie McClelland's biography, Regina Mas seemed like a very simple, nice, earnest woman, very much concerned over her children. I thought it was remarkable that she was so clean in the midst of the camp, where cleanliness is so unbelievably difficult to achieve. Think about it. What if Regina Mas had been a slob? What would have happened to those children? McClelland sympathized deeply with the victims. She cared about them. She was sensitive to the assaults they had endured. She worried if, as I quote from her, I have erred too much in my choices. Still, it fell to her to choose. She applied the rational calculus that she laid out to Margaret Frawley. She did. Yet my point is that irrational factors played a role too, sometimes even tipping the scales. At the safe distance of 3/4 of a century, we assume that social workers such as Marjorie McClelland relied on a logical rubric. Her record offers us a lens onto the complexity of her choices and decisions. Age, gender, religion, social class, degree of peril, all of these played a role in her selection calculus. And so too did her feelings about, her connections to the people who needed her help. So let's return to the beginning. It's been my pleasure to introduce you to some of our Americans. I hope I've been able to convey something to you about the role of gender, as well as about how our Americans were shaped and changed by their own actions. And finally, and as you know by now, most important to me, I hope that by evaluating their record with a fresh eye, I've begun to persuade you that their actions, the daring do and the daily grind, were shaped by messy and slippery factors, just as surely as by obdurate local officials, the looming Germans, geography, finances, or the tide of war.